Uh, Let us begin. Thank you. Thank you very much. Oh, here we are, where we left off. Uh, we should be able to get through a lot of this muscles unit today, and certainly I think we finish it up on Wednesday uh, without any difficulty. Uh, so this, you might recall, this was the about more or less the last slide. And I think the things that are noteworthy, there's really a fairly small latent period when you're talking about neuromuscular connections. It responds pretty rapidly. And again, the distinction is between a rapidly moving muscle that we use all the time, very briefly, versus a muscle that contracts rather substantially, but over a quick period. That's the power muscle. And these ones that have a lot slower development of tension, slower to get there and slower to decline, again, is characteristic of postural muscles. And depending on where you're going, I mean, if you're going into sport or sport related things, that this becomes more significant. A lot of this material has applications in the physical therapy, rehabilitative, occupational therapy realms, athletic training, etc., which are very interesting fields, and I would still think to some extent really in demand fields. So these are the kinds of what we're going to see here are techniques, or some of it's informational, and some of it are really techniques that have been used for forever in physical therapy. I mean, I was using these types of techniques that when I first started doing this, the better part of 50 years ago, and the gentleman who was our physical therapy director at the hospital I trained at, where I was a resident, I mean, he was writing papers on this stuff in the 30s. To give you an idea, he was sort of a legend in South Philadelphia. So, as you can see, a muscle twitch is something we only get in the lab, or if there's some damage. Okay, and graded muscle responses are interesting. It's a little different than doing an eval of a muscle. When you're grading muscle strength, you grade them with and without resistance, uh, a variety of there's about 5 or 6 different grades of muscles. When you suffer a significant muscle injury, a torn muscle, you generally lose a grade in that muscle. And so if you start with 6, which most people have, then you start to lose grades. And that kind of a thing that happens. So we can change each, and this is the more significant, is the frequency of stimulation as opposed to strength of stimulation. So the whole idea of changing the stimulus is you don't allow the calcium to be completely reabsorbed. So you're basically releasing more calcium. The more calcium that's in that area, as we saw with all the cross bridge cycle and excitation contraction coupling, means a greater degree of contraction, and the contracture is sustained. So typically, this is what we see. If the stimuli are separated, let's say to within a second, maybe 10 a second, something just like that, that's ample time for the muscle to contract and to relax and return to its baseline. So you just see these isolated contractures where the tension develops. If we increase this, therefore, the calcium has not had sufficient time to reabsorb or be pumped back in to the terminal cisternae. It's still floating around. What you're going to see means that it doesn't, if we go backwards, completely relax. So now your base point may be here. And what you develop is something called staircasing or temporal summation. So if 2 stimuli, let's say you double it, you're doing 20 of these a second. Now it's time to completely relax, twitches increase, additional calcium is released, and you could actually draw a plateau on top of each of these peaks, and it resembles, to a certain extent, a staircase. That's where it gets its name. Not done yet. So let's say if we increase it by another factor, now rather than 20 of these a second, now we're at 30 a second. Now, if the stimulus frequency increases, it reaches near maximum, smooth continuous contractions that summate. And so what happens if we increase the frequency, it to some extent quivers. And so the name we give to a muscle in spasm is tetany, and that's where the disease name from tetanus derives. But this is called incomplete or unfused tetany. And so even though it is, if you draw a line at the peaks, they're there. And again, this is maybe about 3 of these every 10 seconds. So figure 30 a second, every 10th of a second rather. And so what you see here is unfused tetanus. And then last, as you might guess, if we increase it further still and get up to say 50, 40, 50, 60 of these a second, okay, fused tetanus evolves or results. They fuse into one smooth sustained plateau, and that over time will eventually lead to fatigue. So here you can see the rapid stimuli, but this is probably about maybe 100 of these a second. So about once you get to 50 or 60, you're going to get to that level. We do this in rehab. So for you folks in sport, maybe you've had an injury and did they do electrical stim for some? Okay. That's what this is. We used to call it low volt or galvanic. And basically these days they call it electrical stim. Like I said, it's been around for the better part of 100 years. And every so often things go out of favor. Years ago it was hot packs and ultrasound, and then they did electrical stim, and then they went away from it. It's like stretching. First they did ballistic stretching, like jumping jacks, then they went to, static stretching, then they started to combine them and do Pilates. And if you trace it, there's a very, very interesting history to that. With regard to, and again, I'm sufficiently far enough removed, and my kids are sufficiently far enough removed from sport that I don't have my finger on that particular pulse. Here's what we used to do. When someone came in with, and typically it's back spasm. This is what they go down. You do this in physical therapy. You put the electrical stimulators on. You'd induce tetany. You'd hold it for X amount. You could set it for time. You let it relax, repeat it, let it relax, in an effort over X number of days to eventually break the spasm. Along with, at least for people in traction, use muscle relaxers, painkillers, anti-inflammatory. And it was a little bit different hospital-wise. In those days, you could get days. So you keep somebody in the hospital, and the hospital would be paid for. Nowadays, it's much more of an outpatient world. And so a lot of this has impacted the nature of treatment. We do more of these on outpatient. To strengthen a muscle, you'd use these to build up strength. To increase range of motion, you could do reciprocal. You could put it on a flexor and an extensor and move it back and forth to try to work with range of motion. So this was the go-to for the orthopedic surgeons I trained with these many years ago. Now, if by recruiting we can, this is stimulus strength. It's a little different. It's rather significantly different. It's sent to more muscle fibers, leading to more precise control. So we have subthreshold, threshold, and max. Okay, so subthreshold, we don't have any contraction that we can visibly see on the electromyograph. And threshold, we can see an observable contraction. Maximal is just that. See what happens when we're subthreshold, and they're depicting it here with the darkened areas in the individual fibers and motor units. Notice that as you reach the threshold level and increase it a little by little, you're increasing the degree of contraction. But once you reach maximum, it doesn't matter whether you increase the stimulus voltage. Once you're at maximum, all of the fibers that are involved, all those mutants have been stimulated. So it changes. So it works on a size principle in the sense that the motor units with the small fibers are first, larger fibers as it increases, largest for the most powerful. They contract again asynchronously, so they're not in a set pattern, and it's not all of them simultaneously. This is preset, if you will, to prevent fatigue that occurs. And they're just showing you graphically. Muscle tone is a constant. Okay. With very rare exceptions, muscles are always slightly contracted. The best way I can describe it to you is for those of us like myself who have done bone and joint related surgeries and tendon lengthenings and shortening, you have to take that into account. The person's asleep or anesthetized in some way, shape, or form. So you're trying to simulate what's called the resting tension that's there. If you make it too tight, when they wake up, they might have a finger that's pointing up all the time, okay, or pointing down all the time, depending whether you're doing a flexor or extensor shortening or lengthening. So you have to take this into account. It's something we do naturally, okay? Alternatively, activating Stretch, if it stretches one way, then you have stretch receptors on it. If it contracts one way, stretch receptors the other way. So it's a very much of a reciprocal, flexors and then extensors. And the whole idea is that the muscle, when you don't use a muscle, it atrophies. So and any of you who have been in a cast for a long period of time or a brace for a long period of time have probably appreciated that. If it feels funny, young, healthy individuals, a couple of weeks after a cast, it's like it never was there. We get to isotonic and isometric. Isometric, again, is like you're pushing against a wall. You're definitely exercising, you're definitely strengthening, but you're not shortening. Because it physically you're not able to move the object that's there. Once motion occurs, it becomes an isotonic contraction. The muscle changes in length and moves the load. It can do so concentrically by shortening or eccentrically by lengthening. So whether you're picking something up or putting something down, you're still exercising. It is just a matter, by definition, whether it is a concentric or an eccentric activity. So I pronounce it eccentric. Pronounce it how you want. So isometric, things are not moving, and basically electrically and chemically and mechanically everything is happening, but you can't generate the shortening that's there. As you can see, it generates force, but the actin filaments don't shorten. So, and it's a useful technique that's been around, and isometrics have really been around for a long time. Years ago, they did something called isotonics, and what you were trying to do was sort of marry the two. You were trying to produce your maximum lift. So you'd have a device where you started isometrically, as you always do, and then the device allowed the shortening to occur at very, very limited amounts. So you were trying to maximally exercise and changing the length only very, very small amounts over a period of time. And so the old days, they called that isokinetics. And again, this is for those who go into exercise science or exercise-oriented fields, it becomes more, there's probably a whole different series of nomenclature now. And there's not a lot out of that. That's really sort of the definition. And what I would like to do, if I get a chance to do it today, is, depending on how long our lab takes, which probably only going to take about 40 minutes, is maybe get a volunteer or two to just do some contraction so you can see the relationship between contraction and the electrical activity. It should be fairly easy. I think we probably don't need more than one or two people to record that. And I'll see if I can get that set up. Not a lot of time now, in that hour, but I should be able to get both those things set up that are there. Providing energy for contraction. This is important. It may be surprised, and even people who are very, very well trained and well conditioned, how limited your energy stores are realistically. Understand that most activity starts in an anaerobic sense. We only go on to aerobic activity once our available energy resources are used. And then once you change over into aerobic activity, there's almost an unlimited amount of time in activity reasonably that you can do. Okay, so we start with our number one building block, ATP, energy needed for the muscle fiber. Moves and detaches cross bridges, does the pumping, sodium potassium pumps, excitation, contraction, coupling, 4 to 6 seconds. Most of the activities that you and I do take fractions of a second. You reach for something, you type something, you get something off of a counter, you walk from here to there, you change positions. It's fractions of a second. You immediately replenish this once you go into a rest mode. Okay, so it is regenerated very quickly by definition. But suppose you're doing a physical activity where it's going to have a longer than 4 to 6 second duration. Where does the next layer of energy comes from? It follows this pathway. The next one is direct phosphorylation of ADP by creatine phosphate. So it's really a form of substrate phosphorylation, kind of like, what you learned about in glycolysis. See, I remembered that. Not bad for an old guy. See, opportunity to say what? You're really not thinking. And if Mackenzie had her speaker on, she would have said something. Okay. Direct phosphorylation of ADP by creatine phosphate. So we have this magical substance that's got a high energy bond, just like we do in glycolysis, that happens to be called creatine phosphate. Okay. Erroneously. Again, years ago, and everybody knows somebody who ingests protein powders constantly. Okay. There's nothing wrong with that from a standpoint of utilizing protein powders if you're young, healthy, and your kidneys can get rid of the excessive nitrogen. Okay. The notion that they would ingest creatine, it would magically make more of this, is not true. Yeah, I mean, you've done, all of you have done this basically in biochemistry and related subjects. What do we do when we ingest a protein? We break it down to amino acids. How do we utilize it? Most of the time, we lop off. We break it down to this component amino acids. So creatine ingesting does not make creatinine ingestion doesn't make creatine phosphate directly. Gives us a whole lot of building blocks. And if you're doing an appropriate exercise program with other appropriate nutrition, you'll probably make more muscle mass. But that was a mistaken notion. And I guess the big problem is people whose kidneys can't handle the nitrogen load. More on that when we get to the urinary tract and renal function. So that's your next step. Then your available transformative high energy phosphates are gone. Now we have to rely on glycolysis, and unfortunately, waste products in the form of lactic acid and irregular accumulations of ionic compounds limit us. And finally, when all is said and done, and right now we barely have a minute into our anaerobic activity, if we don't convert to aerobic activity. What's aerobic activity? It's basically married to me. It's marrying your heart rate and your breathing and your circulation. So you have to be using big muscles to be able to do this. You have to alter. Think of yourself on a treadmill, whether you're doing a walk or a run, whatever it is. And how do you able to do that for hours at a time? Even somebody who's, as my wife will tell you, telling me to get in shape, and I keep telling her, she laughs, round is shape. Doesn't work. You heard that one before, didn't you? Nevertheless, you can go on there for a long period of time because aerobic activity is just that. And scientifically, when we get to the cardiac unit, I think most people know by now that the whole idea of doing the cardio activity is getting your aerobic and your heart rate up to a certain level for a sustained period of time. Okay, and you can convert that into enhancement of your immune system, enhancement of your cardiovascular system, and produce weight loss as well, if whatever your goal might be. So here's the ADP by creatine phosphate nugget, an unusual molecule located in muscle fibers that has that high energy phosphate, made possible by creatine kinase, enough ATP and creatine phosphate reserves 15 seconds. Okay, that's next. So not a whole lot. The anaerobic pathway. So we take our limited stores of glucose, mostly in the form of glycogen. So we have glycogen being utilized, glycolysis occurring. Understand that when you're actively using the muscles are contracting. What that means is your blood supply is not getting into the muscle. And that causes several problems. One, you don't have any oxygen, certainly. And the other is you don't have, it's not just about going in, it's about coming out. And now you have an accumulation of waste products. And that's a two-edged sword. Okay, glucose is broken down all day into pyruvate. because it's glycolysis. We have no place to go with those reduced, NADs and whatever. Not doing that yet. It's been too long. But they've got to have a parking place for the electrons. Where do they park them? On pyruvate. And it makes lactate. Okay? Low oxygen levels prevent pyruvic acid from entering the aerobic respiration phase. Okay? So normally we know it goes into the mitochondria, but with a bulging muscle compression, oxygen delivery impaired, we becomes anaerobic glycolysis and lactic acid accumulates. So you're altering the pH. It's an acid that's accumulating. You're accumulating a variety of waste products because you don't have any venous outflow from the muscles and no additional oxygen inflow into the muscles. All of that is going to eventually lead to a point where the muscle can no longer function. And effectively, you can't use it anymore. The fatigue factor is there. It's the muscle is either going to give way from damage, or you're going to have to stop the activity and take the steps necessary to reverse the process, which are stopping the activity and what we used to call catching your breath. In other words, restoring the oxygen, allowing it to circulate, allowing the liver to change over the lactate back into pyruvate, recreate the glycogen, go back to the starting point. And that's what will happen unless you adjust your heart rate and your breathing and the degree of intensity of your activity to make the transition into aerobic activity. So lactic acid in the bloodstream, there's a limited amount of fuel supply that it can have, liver, kidneys, and heart, converted back to glucose in the liver. And again, obviously it's not nearly as beneficial as aerobic activity. And so our whole energy production now is 30 to 40 seconds more. So we're reading that as a total of somewhere between 45 seconds, maybe a minute. And so when we are aerobically respiring, whether we're at rest or we're doing, and really that's the watchword, light to moderate, you can increase the degree of intensity to a certain extent. And that, again, would come mostly with training. Okay. The chemical reactions that occur, we know about, not going to go into. We're not going to analyze how many ATPs there are, et cetera, et cetera. Fuels used include glucose from glycogen, blood-borne glucose, free fatty acids, very beneficial. And that's what I mean. Once you get past that 30 minutes of aerobic activity, you've accomplished two things. Okay, one, that's typically enough time if you do that, and depending on the author, 3 to 6 times per week, reaching that target heart rate for cardiac benefit. Your immune system benefits. The way I view it, effectively you're increasing the degree of circulation out of the bone marrow, sort of replenishing, and utilizing. It's almost like it's like an oil change for your white blood cells. You want to think of it that way. But effectively, that's kind of what's happening. And at that point, now you're into fat burn. And for a lot of people, that's very often that's the goal. Here we are, first year, New Year's resolution. I'm going to lose X amount of, and they, I always see the gym memberships increase exponentially. And then, by February, they're gone. You should see me at the gym. I have the AirPods in. Dancing around
deadlift like 600 pounds, right?
I don't do the lifting at all. I was at one point good with bench presses.
Oh yeah, you probably slammed those.
I did not slam, but I didn't.
What was your max?
Not a lot. Not a lot. Under 200 pounds. I wasn't that big. Hey, I'm not. It's all right. I always had mental strength as opposed to physical strength.
All you need.
No, it's good. It's good to be healthy. Or in the words of Mel Brooks, it's good to be a king. Remember the king? Shut up, Lou. But you do a fat burn. Voila. So, energy systems, aerobic endurance. Okay. For long periods of time, anaerobic threshold. Muscle metabolism converts to the anaerobic path. Those are just some definitions, not a big deal. But I think you get the idea of what I'm talking about. Fatigue is that physiological inability to contract despite trying to contract. The big problem with spasms, which usually are what stop people, are less about lactic acid and more about ionic imbalances because of, you see, potassium, sodium, calcium, disrupting membrane potentials, increased inorganic phosphate breakdown, interfering with calcium release from the sarcoplasmic reticulum. So their changes are, and we see this a lot, and maybe you notice it after, a workout. Maybe as you get older, you tend to get a lot of involuntary spasms, which people for years have called Charlie horses. But you begin to notice those, and and a lot of it is electrolytic in nature. I really think potassium sometimes is the key to that. One of the ways that really helps with that is bananas, which are a really good source of potassium. So, I mean, just as an aside, that was always a go-to thing and you can see a lot of athletes will do that, even in sports that don't look that vigorous. I mean, look at somebody, they're walking 6-7 miles up and down hills in golf, but there's a lot of banana munching that's going on in there, if you notice it. And surely the fittest of all those athletes is Tiger Woods. Okay, for years. I mean, notwithstanding, his other physical problems, but he changed the game because of his physical condition more than anything else. Because then all of a sudden everybody started to do it. Okay. So all of those decreased ATP, it increased magnesium levels, interfering with voltage-sensitive T tubules, decreased glycogen. It's usually not the lack of ATP. And this is what I call catching your breath. They have a wonderful name, excess post-exercise oxygen consumption, or EPOC. So to me, I don't go crazy over that while I'm done. So we move on to this last PowerPoint in this particular sequence, which is interesting, and it has a little bit to do with some of the nuances. There's not a lot left with regard to skeletal muscles. We save the cardiac muscles for the cardiac unit, okay, and then the rest of this deals with principally with smooth muscle, which is very much of a different thing. And again, you're going to underscore the distinction in both cardiac and smooth muscle, where extracellular calcium levels are really an important aspect, as opposed to here where it's intracellular. And really, that's the point from what you'll see as we begin to look at here with calcium channel blockers. So, contraction number of cross bridges makes sense, which is affected by 4 factors. Muscle fibers stimulated. That's the recruitment. More motor units, more force. The size of the fibers. Muscle cells in hypertrophy. They either atrophy or hypertrophy. They don't undergo hyperplasia. You work with what you have. Stimulation frequency. As we saw before, the higher the frequency, we can maximize the force. And where it starts, the degree of stretch, is particularly telling. The muscle fibers, the sarcomeres have about whatever their resting state with. It can be 20% stretched to 20% contracted, and you can still generate sufficient force. If the sarcomere is shortened by greater than that, less than 80% of its resting length, there's so much overlap. It's like trying to generate force when you have a muscle that's normally like this and it's contracted to here. You can't generate. I mean, ask the guy who teaches the physics who just got a haircut. Ask Dr. Buxton. I mean, you can't generate a lot of force with the muscle disorder. Remember, isn't that that mass times acceleration? How much acceleration can you get? Okay. That whole, you can't. There's just not enough length over time squared to be able to do that, right? Isn't that acceleration? And I don't even do physics. Okay. On the other hand, if it's The corollary to on the other hand is you can count on me. 1, 2, 3. Soupy Sales, 1962. Look them up. And what is involved with that is if it is too stretched, you cannot develop that ratcheting effect that generates that rapid degree of acceleration. Again, you can't generate the force, and you'll see that. Not enough overlap. So, okay, frequency, we understand temporal stimulation, number of muscle fibers, big muscle fibers, the shortening and lengthening. This is a really good illustration. Here's that 100%. If you're at 75, look at how much overlap is already there. There's not a lot of room for that to contract. And here, it's very hard when you don't have enough active sites that can be potentially exposed to one another. You're just not going to develop the force. There are some subtle variations in muscle fibers that impact this as well. So we can look at slow or fast fibers, and it has to do with the enzyme myosin ATPase and different patterns of electrical activity. Metabolic pathways are involved in this, called oxidative and glycolytic. Oxidative fibers are aerobic-based fibers. Think of longer-term use versus anaerobic fibers, short-term use that are there. And so skeletal muscle fibers can be classified into just 3 types: slow and fast oxidative or fast glycolytic. And most muscles are a mixture, and that's genetically based. So it results in a significant range of contractile speed and fatigue resistance. In one motor unit, they're all the same type, but it's genetically based. So it's over the years, I had so many patients. One guy, dedicated distance runner. His whole goal was to be able to qualify for Boston's marathon. Okay, and it's based on age. So you have, if you're in an age group, you have to have a qualifying time. And interesting, in this neck of the woods, most people went up to Presque Isles Marathon. It's flat to get their best time. So they look for a flat marathon. Maybe they do the Marine Corps Marathon in Washington, relatively flat, to be able to get their optimal time. He never could do it. I mean, here is this guy who was a scratch golfer, a very fine athlete, great tennis player, but genetically he didn't have that mixture with sufficient aerobic fibers to be able to do this. So he never could get to that unit. It's just not there. There aren't that many. So when you see, to me, it's a treasure to see elite athletes, but you have to realize that it's training, but to a certain amount of to me, it's God given. That's the way I look at it. I'm privileged enough to have seen a lot of those over my lifespan, and as have you. So it's really remarkable in that regard. So some are suited for slow oxidative endurance, get postural muscle, fast oxidative. So this is soleus, that big calf muscle. The power muscle, sprinting, is certainly gastrocnemius. Fast glycolytic, different. So think of a combination of muscles that can do fast and glycolytic to generate, now with all the metrics, we look at bat speed and things like that. Do you guys in softball, do you study those as well? Is that something they measure for your? Because it's for my day and age, we never heard of that stuff. Okay, all the metrics, and you can see the metrics, the employment statistics, football, whether to go for it on 4th down and what's the down and distance and field position, etc. So it's a whole new world. All of those metrics and the different statistics they use to analyze baseball are relatively recent. Relatively recent, within the last 40 or 50 years. Purists were didn't look at it that way, but it's there. It's true. Muscles contract fasted when you don't have a load. The heavier your load, the harder it's going to be to contract it, and you're going to have to recruit or bring in more units into it. And that's pretty straightforward. And then the whole idea of endurance exercises. What do they do? Capillaries, mitochondria, myoglobin synthesis, endurance, okay. And you can actually convert some of these fast glycolytic into fast oxidative. So it depends on what you're trying to achieve. And this is where the training nugget comes in as well. When you're trying to do increase range of motion, okay, increase endurance, you tend to do activities without an excessive amount of load. When you're rehabilitating to increase muscle strength, or let's say to rehabilitate a knee or an ankle, you tend to do progressive, what they call PREs, or progressive resistant exercises. The amount of times that you do it, the number of sets, and the frequency you do it stays relatively constant. You increase the amount of load that's against it. Whether you're using ankle weights, let's say, or doing straight leg raises with ankle weights for a knee or something along those lines. They've been around for a long time. Typically, when you have somebody with a back injury, you're having them in the old days. They're really a series of crunches that you would do. And again, depending on whether you were trying to, typically you wanted to increase strength, because backs are inherently have to rely on paraspinal musculature to be able to maintain strength, as well as abdominal musculature. So those were the two sets that you began to work with. So, I mean, there's a whole lot of theories with regards. So this is the resistant exercises. They're typically anaerobic. Weight length, weightlifting or isometric, and again, progressively increasing the resistance at intervals. And you're inducing hypertrophy, etc., increasing all the intercellular components, size and strength. So again, atrophy of disuse, immobilization, lack of nerve supply, very quickly. And so now I think things have changed in the sense that we are looking at perhaps more now why we have taken people out of casts. One, the quality of materials that we have available are different. When the air cast, and it was noted last night where they put, Pollard was put in an air cast. He had a fractured fibula, okay? As the diagnosis was made overnight. The air cast, interestingly, was invented, are you ready? Summit, New Jersey, by the original air cast company. And a little heel piece they used to buy for my dad, because he had the materials that they used for the heel. So I know a lot about the company. And I was using them in the early days. Effectively, it's a stirrup. So that was sort of the start where we began to see taking people out of casts, which increased atrophy, and using a variety of splints that were removable. And that was one of the early parts of it. So a little nugget from Stein's Foot Specialties. Business my dad and grandfather started in 1931. Go on Amazon, look for, I don't know who sells them today, but look for Stein's pads. They are there. Why didn't I go into the business? I could have been a millionaire. Why am I driving a 2012 Subaru with 240,000 miles? Spending money on the dog and the cats. So as you can see, because of the decline in muscle strength, paralysis, what happens, the loss of, anytime you're losing tissue, scar tissue, fatty tissue, connective tissue, okay, and it precludes it, which brings us to, and I'm just going to introduce this and we'll finish it up, smooth muscles. And really, a lot of our course in physiology has much more to do with smooth muscles than skeletal muscles. This is the skeletal muscle nugget, as you're seeing here, and we're going to see it in the next unit with nerve physiology. But after that, it's all about smooth, other than the cardiac muscle, it's all about smooth muscles. Hollow tubes for circulation, for respiration, for genitourinary function, digestive function. That's what it's all about. So smooth muscles are organized in sheets that are tightly packed. Their organization is totally different than skeletal muscle organization. That's there. Most of those organs, these are two layers, and typically they have a longitudinal layer and a circular layer. Okay, most of the time, that hollow tube, and again, the opening in a hollow tube we call the lumen. Okay, so if you look at any hollow tubular structure, and however you want to create that, so let's say you take something like this. This is the lumen. The paper constitutes typically has circular fibers and then longitudinal fibers. Circular fibers closest to the center, more centrally placed, and more peripherally placed longitudinal fibers. Sometimes you'll have additional layers, external or internal to that, but that's a pretty consistent finding that's there. And so you can have, and it's a combination, and this really is what creates the motion that you're going to become most familiar with, which is called peristalsis. And peristalsis is squeezing and pushing. I'm thinking toothpaste at the bottom that you got to push out to the top. None of you you're not responsive today. Let's try that again. Aha, toothpaste, squeeze it, push, squeeze it, push. I forgot to go to the store and get more toothpaste. I got to get that little bit out. Right? That's what I'm talking about. Contractions, that's squeezing and pushing. Alternate contractions and relaxation. Squeeze substances through the lumen of hollow organs. The fibers are consistently spindle shaped, so they're sort of wider in the middle. Okay, and you're going to see as they contract, they shorten in a unique way, not the same. Okay, they're thin and short compared with skeletal muscle fibers, which we know are long, which are wider and much, much longer. They have one nucleus. They do not have the visible striations that you're so familiar with. They don't have that perimecium, epimecium, perimecium. They both only have endomecium. They don't have the neuromuscular junction that we spent a tremendous amount of time over the last couple of episodes here talking about. They have what are called varicosities. Hello, folks. I see, they actually like me. They don't know me very well, but they like me. They're AP2 students, so they have it easy. They actually speak nicely about me.
Everyone that takes A and P together says that it's harder than
Huh? Oh, yeah.
Oh.
Actually, I prefer it that way also. But they did this because we have, the folks who come from comparative vert, okay, and taking the physiology component. It's okay. Hey, you got, remember the 11th commandment, thou shalt be flexible. Which is why I do stretching exercises.
Oh, yeah.
Oh, like I did them all weekend. I'd reach for the remote. I'd reach for the drink. I'd reach for something to eat. Those are stretching exercises. I'd pet the dog. The dog would bring his ball over. I'd throw it at him. It's just I was exercising all weekend. Not burning a lot, maybe a calorie at a time, one. So varicosities, as you will see, in veins are enlargements that should not be there, but varicosities here are the nomenclature we use for the variation of what is an unusual junction that creates, rather than having the typical neuromuscular junction. So those varicosities are where the neurotransmitters are stored, and the synaptic cleft is not a neuromuscular junction, but it's a diffuse junction, name you should know. They're innervated by the autonomic nervous system, which we will get to after we do the next chapter, which is the basically neurophysiology, then we'll specialize into, okay, the next area of the autonomic nervous system from a lecture perspective. So these are the autonomic nerves. These little bulbous areas that you can see are called varicosities. Okay. Most of the time, you're going to see they typically contain acetylcholine for the most part, not all, but I think that's the predominant neurotransmitter. As you can see, usual synaptic vesicles, mitochondria, etc. The smooth muscle does not have the elaborate, and these are the differences that are important. They don't have that interesting sarcoplasmic reticulum with all the terminal cisternae. They don't have T tubules. It's not as developed. It doesn't store intracellular calcium. Most of the calcium is extracellular. And the sarcolemma, and this is what brings it in, have these very interesting infoldings called caveolae. And the caveolae have the calcium channels that open to allow for the rapid influx of the extracellular calcium. So we're going to start here looking at the caveolae, looking at these, yes, voltage-gated calcium channels, and then finally the sarcoplasmic reticulum calcium channels that are inside of the calcium that's there. So we're going to look at the calcium and then carry it on into the contraction of the smooth muscle. So thank you. We're done. See all you guys in lab in an hour or
Did
so.
we cut open those rabbits?
What?
We doing the rabbit
Well, the
dissection?
rabbits are already cut open.
Oh,
We were just getting pieces of.
Where's lab at?
Oh, lab is over in the zoo lab. Okay.
Okay.
Yeah. Bio one lab, whatever you want to call it.
How long will lab be?